Ethan Blackwood, a ruthless billionaire haunted by a hidden past, secretly follows Naomi Hart, his quiet housekeeper, with a tragic secret. When he discovers her brother died exposing corruption that built his fortune, their worlds collide in a storm of guilt, truth, and impossible forgiveness. As Ethan fights to make amends, Naomi must decide if confronting him will heal old wounds or break her all over again. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories about redemption, resilience, and the cost of facing the past. Ethan Blackwood hadn't intended to linger in the shadows of his own penthouse, but something about Naomi Hart made it impossible to look away. On any given evening, she moved through his immaculate space as if it belonged to her more than to him. Polishing the gleaming countertops, collecting the stray coffee cups he left behind in half-woken stupors, and arranging the books on the shelves with an almost reverent precision. She was 39, just 3 years younger than him, but he'd never met someone who carried so much quiet certainty in her presence. It was as though she had built a citadel of calm around herself, and the world's noise simply couldn't touch her. He told himself that this was why he watched her. It wasn't infatuation, he insisted, or even curiosity. It was something more rational, a question he hadn't yet found the shape of. But some nights, when he returned home too early and found Naomi still there, he'd catch himself standing behind a half-closed door, listening to the soft scrape of her shoes against the marble floors, and wondering if he'd ever known what it meant to be at peace. On a damp Thursday evening, the first drizzle of autumn pattering against the floor-to-ceiling windows, Ethan came home from a late meeting to find Naomi just finishing her tasks. She stood by the glass doors leading to the balcony, her slim figure outlined by the city lights blinking far below. Her dark hair was pinned neatly in place, though a few strands had slipped free and curled against her cheek. She didn't look at him as he entered. She rarely did, unless she had a reason. Instead, she wiped down the railing with a practiced hand, her motions precise and efficient. "I thought you'd be home later," she said finally, without turning. "I wrapped up early." He loosened the knot of his tie and watched her reflection in the glass. "You don't have to finish everything tonight. You could leave the balcony for tomorrow." She gave a small, polite shrug. "I prefer to end the day with everything in order." There was no reproach in her tone, but something in the simplicity of the words stung him. Naomi Hart was the kind of woman who never left a single dish unwashed or a single truth unspoken. It made Ethan, whose success was built on elaborate deals and elegant half-lies, feel strangely exposed. He watched her gather her cleaning cloths and set them in her canvas tote. She never brought a plastic bag, always the same battered canvas, monogrammed NH in faded letters. He found that detail absurdly endearing. "Will you need anything else, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were an unremarkable brown in daylight, but in the lamplight, they glowed with a rich amber warmth that made his throat tighten. "No," he said, a little too quickly. "That will be all." She inclined her head and slipped past him without another word, disappearing down the hallway that led to the private elevator. Ethan stood there, feeling the echo of her departure, a hush settling over the penthouse that felt more like loss than relief. When the elevator doors finally sighed closed, he exhaled. He told himself he needed to let it go. Naomi Hart was an employee, nothing more. He signed her paychecks. He didn't need to know why she stayed so late some evenings, or why she sometimes emerged from the service corridor with a flicker of sorrow in her eyes. Yet as he poured himself a drink, something peaty and old enough to dull the restless curiosity, he knew he'd already made the decision. The next night, he left the office early but didn't go home. Instead, he parked his discreet gray sedan across the street from the service entrance of the building where Naomi lived. He felt ridiculous, like a teenager waiting for a glimpse of a crush, but he couldn't bring himself to drive away. Hours passed. The street emptied out, and the city fell into the hush of a weekday night. He told himself he'd give her another 10 minutes, then 5. Then, at 10:47 p.m., the lobby door swung open, and Naomi stepped out into the puddle-glossed sidewalk, wearing a slate-gray raincoat and carrying that same canvas tote. She didn't look around, didn't seem anxious or secretive. But as she passed under the glow of a street lamp, Ethan saw something in her face that made him lean forward against the steering wheel. Determination edged with grief. He started the engine only after she turned the corner. He kept a careful distance as she walked briskly down 2 blocks, then another, until she reached a squat, red brick building wedged between a shuttered pharmacy and a pawn shop. A faded sign over the door read, "Community Resource and Education Center." Ethan parked in a loading zone without caring. He watched Naomi punch a code into the door, slip inside, and vanish. He waited 5 minutes, telling himself this was enough. He'd satisfied his curiosity, but the building's cracked windows glowed with warm light, and he imagined her moving inside, talking to someone, doing something he couldn't begin to guess. His pulse drummed in his ears. He needed to know. He got out of the car, feeling the rain beat on his hair and run cold down the collar of his coat. He approached the building cautiously, testing the knob. It turned easily under his hand. Inside, the air smelled of damp concrete and coffee. A long hallway stretched ahead, lined with hand-painted murals of children reading books under sprawling trees. He followed the sound of voices to a doorway at the end. Naomi stood near a folding table piled with lesson materials, speaking softly to a boy of about 12. She was explaining something about fractions, her voice patient and warm. Around the room, 6 other children sat at mismatched chairs, scribbling in workbooks. Ethan watched from the doorway, unable to reconcile this image with the woman who moved silently through his penthouse every night. Here, she was confident, almost radiant. She laughed when the boy made a joke about stupid math, and she ruffled his hair as though she'd known him forever. He felt something loosen in his chest. Admiration. Maybe even longing. After 20 minutes, Naomi glanced up and saw him. Her eyes widened, then narrowed with a wariness he had never seen. She murmured something to the boy, patted his shoulder, and crossed the room in measured steps. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice low but urgent. "I was passing by," he lied, hating himself for how easily the falsehood came. "I?" "You were passing by," she repeated flatly, her gaze flicking to the door behind him. "And you decided to come inside, just to watch." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no reasonable explanation, and they both knew it. Naomi took a deep breath, as if she were trying to steady her heart. "This is my personal time, Mr. Blackwood. You have no right to follow me here." "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to." "No," she interrupted, her voice firm. "You did mean to. I don't know why, but you did." She didn't look angry so much as weary, like someone who'd had enough of men with too much power and too little restraint. He wanted to explain, wanted to tell her that he wasn't here out of malice or suspicion, that he'd been drawn by something he didn't fully understand. But the words felt absurd even in his own mind. Naomi turned back to the children, dismissing him without another glance. Ethan hesitated in the doorway. For a moment, he considered leaving and never speaking of this again. But instead, he took a step closer. "I didn't come here to threaten you," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "I wanted to know who you were when you weren't in my apartment." Naomi froze but didn't look back. "I'm no one," she said finally. "Just a woman doing her job." Ethan thought of the way she had smiled at the boy, the kindness in her hands as she arranged his papers. He thought of the tidy rows of books in his home and the small notes she sometimes left. "Please remember to take your vitamins, sir," written in her careful script. "No," he whispered. "You're not no one." She didn't answer. When he finally turned and walked away, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected. Shame. Not the superficial discomfort of being caught, but the deeper knowledge that he had crossed a line that could never be erased. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. He stood in it for a moment, letting it soak his hair, his collar, the fine wool of his coat. For once, he didn't care how it looked. In that moment, Ethan Blackwood understood that no amount of money or status could protect him from the consequences of wanting something he had no right to claim. He climbed back into his car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. But even as the city swallowed the small brick building behind him, he knew he would return. Because whatever this was, curiosity, guilt, longing, it had already lodged itself too deeply in him to be shaken free. And for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't sure whether he hoped that Naomi would forgive him or that she never would. The following morning dawned gray and bleary, as if the city itself was ashamed of everything that had passed in the night. Ethan awoke in a fog of questions, none of which he wanted to answer. He lingered in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince himself he hadn't ruined something irretrievably. By the time he arrived at his office, he was already late for the standing meeting with his senior executives. But he offered no apology as he strode past the glass-walled conference room. Let them wonder, he thought grimly. For once in his life, he had no appetite for appearances. He shut himself in his private office and dropped into the leather chair behind his enormous desk. The morning briefing packet sat unopened where his assistant had left it, the top sheet clipped with a yellow post-it. Reminder, 2 p.m. call with the Hong Kong partners. He ignored it. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled to the number he never should have saved. Marcus Keene, private investigator. Discretion guaranteed. Ethan had never needed to look far for information. In his world, secrets were currency, and he had always been willing to pay whatever it cost to keep the balance sheet in his favor. But this was different. He had no intention of destroying Naomi Hart, no intention of weaponizing what he learned. He just couldn't shake the conviction that if he could understand her past, maybe he could understand why she'd gotten under his skin. And why her gaze, steady and unimpressed, made him feel like a man whose empire was built on sand. He tapped out a terse message. Need a full work and education history. Family background. Discreet. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the send button, but in the end he pressed it anyway. The reply came 3 minutes later. Understood. We'll begin immediately. Ethan set the phone face down on the desk and closed his eyes. A part of him felt filthy, as if he'd trespassed yet again. But another part, the same part that had followed her through the rain, felt a sick relief. Soon, he would have answers. And maybe then he could put all of this behind him. But that night, he couldn't bring himself to go home. Instead, he drove aimlessly across the city, past shuttered shops and diners still glowing with late-night neon. He ended up in a neighborhood he hadn't visited in years, a place his father used to bring him when he was a boy, before money and ambition had eclipsed simpler things. He parked and walked until he found himself standing before the rusting chain-link fence that surrounded the old recreation yard. Through the gaps in the fence, he could see the cracked asphalt court where he'd first learned to play basketball, the faded white lines that once defined the boundaries of the game. It was all smaller than he remembered. He thought of Naomi's voice as she had spoken to the boy at the community center, gentle, warm, patient in a way he'd never heard her speak to anyone else. He thought of how she'd looked at him when she'd realized he'd followed her. Not angry, just tired. As if she'd seen this before. Men who believed that wanting was the same as deserving. Ethan turned away from the fence, but the echo of that look followed him all the way back to his car. 2 days later, Marcus called. Ethan almost didn't pick up, but curiosity and dread had become inseparable by then. He answered on the 3rd ring. I have your report, Marcus said without preamble. It's interesting. Ethan's stomach clenched. What does that mean? Miss Hart's employment history is consistent with what she listed on her application. Housekeeping for a succession of high-end residences. Nothing unusual there. But her education records, those are incomplete. Incomplete how? She attended college on a partial scholarship, studied social work. Her transcripts show good standing. Then she withdrew abruptly in her final year. Why? Marcus hesitated, and Ethan felt the hairs on his arms rise. It seems her older brother died under suspicious circumstances. Officially ruled an accident, but there were rumors. He worked as a junior accountant for a company called Stratus Ventures. Ethan swallowed. The name rang uncomfortably familiar. Stratus. That was one of my early acquisitions. Correct. Around the time you acquired controlling interest, there was a financial scandal. Misappropriated funds, regulatory violations. Nothing ever stuck to you personally, but a handful of lower-level employees were investigated. Her brother, David Hart, was one of them. Ethan closed his eyes, and he died. Yes, fell from the roof of a parking garage. Witnesses said he'd been agitated, making phone calls, threatening to expose something. A dull throb started behind Ethan's temples. Did Naomi know? There's no way to be sure, But she withdrew from school the week after the funeral, moved back home for a year. After that, she reappeared in the city and started working under the radar, off-the-books jobs, cash payments. It's possible she wanted to avoid attention. Ethan ran a hand over his face. "Thank you, Marcus. That's enough. Do you want me to keep digging?" "No," he said hoarsely. "No, that's all." He ended the call and let the phone slide from his hand to the polished wood of the desk. For a moment, he couldn't move. The weight of what he'd just heard pressed down on him, heavier than any boardroom defeat or market collapse. He'd thought he was searching for something benign, an explanation for why Naomi seemed so composed, so unreachable. He hadn't imagined he'd find the ghost of his own past waiting for him in the footnotes of her life. He thought of the way she looked at him, steady, unflinching, and wondered if she'd always known. If she'd cleaned his home, organized his files, accepted his paychecks, all the while carrying that knowledge like a blade she chose not to draw. He couldn't decide which possibility unsettled him more. That she was unaware, or that she'd known and judged him silently every day. He spent the rest of the afternoon staring out the window, the city's skyline blurred and shimmering in the wan autumn light. He didn't go home that night. He checked into a hotel instead, a place no one would think to look for him, and lay awake in the dark, replaying every interaction he'd ever had with Naomi Hart, searching her expression for some clue he'd missed. In the morning, he returned to the penthouse to find it spotless, just as he'd left it. The floors gleamed, the kitchen counters were free of clutter. Even the books on the shelves had been dusted and realigned. There was no trace of Naomi anywhere, no forgotten cloth, no note. For a moment he wondered if she'd simply vanished, and the idea filled him with an irrational panic. But at precisely 6 p.m., she arrived, as she always did. She moved through the entryway with her usual quiet efficiency, as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis. Ethan watched from the living room, his throat tight. He told himself he could pretend nothing had changed. He could let her go on believing, if she even did, that he was nothing more than an employer with a restless conscience. But the knowledge pressed against his ribs like a bruise he couldn't ignore. She was adjusting the drapes when he finally spoke. "Naomi," she turned, eyebrows lifted in polite inquiry. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood?" He opened his mouth. For a moment he almost confessed everything. That he knew about her brother. That he'd followed her, not just to the community center, but all the way back to the darkest corner of her past. But the words lodged in his throat, too heavy to force free. Instead, he said, "I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to accept a small raise, for all you do." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Caution, perhaps, or disappointment. "That isn't necessary." "I insist," he said, hating the brittle edge in his own voice. "I'd like to make sure you feel valued." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, "As you wish." And just like that, she turned back to her work, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't tried to buy penance with money. He sat there, feeling like the cheapest kind of coward. Later that evening, when she'd gone, he walked the rooms she had cleaned, each one immaculate and orderly. But in the hush she left behind, he felt only the certainty that he had trespassed somewhere sacred and now could never return to innocence. He poured himself a drink, but it didn't taste like absolution. It tasted like surrender. He wondered what she would do if she knew everything. If she would walk away, her spine straight, her chin lifted in that quiet defiance he admired. Or if she would stay and let the knowledge corrode every interaction between them until nothing remained but resentment and regret. Ethan set the glass down, untouched. He built a life on the premise that information was power, that knowing more meant controlling more. But standing in the dim hush of his perfect hollow home, he realized that some truths didn't liberate. They only bound you tighter to the things you feared most. And though he didn't know it yet, that was the beginning of a reckoning he would not be able to escape. The city slipped into early winter with little fanfare. Cold rain polished the sidewalks into mirrors, and every gust of wind rattled the bare trees along Ethan's block. Inside his penthouse, the heat was kept at a precise 71 degrees, but no matter how many fires he lit in the gas hearth, the rooms felt colder than ever. He tried to busy himself with work, negotiations in Singapore, a possible merger in Berlin, but even the thrill of closing a high-stakes deal had dulled to something perfunctory. He woke in the dark, checked the time, and wondered if Naomi had already started her morning routine in whatever small apartment she kept. He wondered if she ever thought of him outside the confines of his polished walls. He told himself that if he could only stay away, if he could resist the impulse to watch her, this fascination would burn itself out. But late one night, when his restlessness crested into something sharper, he found himself again driving past the community center. The building was dark, closed for the weekend. The windows were covered with grates to keep out vandals. Ethan parked across the street, feeling absurd in his tailored overcoat, like a trespasser in a place that belonged to simpler people. He stayed there for nearly an hour, engine idling, until he convinced himself he was only wasting time. He drove home with the same hollowness expanding behind his ribs. The next evening, he returned to his penthouse early, determined to face Naomi like a civilized man. To say something, anything, that might bridge the gulf he had created. But she was already there when he arrived, standing in the kitchen arranging fresh flowers in a tall glass vase. She didn't look up as he set his briefcase on the counter. Her profile was composed, beautiful in a way that made him ache. "Naomi," he began, unsure of what he meant to say. She slid a white tulip into place before she answered. "Mr. Blackwood," he swallowed. I want to apologize for the other night." Her hand stilled on the stems, but she didn't lift her gaze. "Which night?" He winced. She was going to make him say it. Good. He deserved nothing less. "When I followed you to the center." The silence stretched between them, a taut and delicate thread. She finally set the vase aside and turned to face him fully. Her eyes were not cold exactly, but they were wary, like a door locked from within. "Why did you do that?" she asked softly. "Because I needed to know you," he almost said. "Because you made me feel something I haven't felt in years." Instead, he cleared his throat and lied the way he'd always lied to everyone. "I was concerned. You were working long hours, and I thought that I was doing something I shouldn't," she finished, her voice low but steady. "That I was stealing, or lying, or what? Selling information about you?" "I didn't think that," he protested, though in truth he hadn't known what he thought, only that he couldn't stand not knowing. Naomi looked down at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was so calm it nearly broke him. "I have worked in many houses. I have been invisible in all of them. But you watched me." She lifted her gaze, and there was no softness left. "Do you have any idea how that feels? To be looked at as if you're a puzzle to be solved instead of a person?" He had no answer. Not one that would absolve him. She nodded slightly, as if she'd expected his silence. Then she stepped past him to collect her tote bag. "I won't quit," she said. "I need the job, but don't ever follow me again." He reached out, intending to touch her arm, to anchor her in place and plead for another chance. But at the last moment, he let his hand fall. Some boundaries could not be crossed without destroying what little remained between them. That night, he poured himself a drink he didn't want and sat by the window, watching the lights blink on the river. He thought of all the things he might have said, true things, and all the ways he'd failed to say them. He understood now that Naomi was not simply a curiosity or an antidote to his loneliness. She was a mirror, showing him exactly what kind of man he had become. The days that followed settled into a strained rhythm. Naomi continued her work with the same precise efficiency. She greeted him when necessary and never lingered in any room he occupied. She wore her hair pinned high and never let a single strand escape. He wondered if it was armor, a way to remind herself and him that she would not allow another trespass. But if she had erected a wall between them, he had built a matching one around himself. He told himself that was for the best. That if he kept his distance, he might salvage some shred of respect between them. Yet no matter how many hours he spent in meetings or how many calls he made to distant boardrooms, he couldn't shake the knowledge that he had crossed a line that could never be erased. 3 weeks passed this way. On the 4th Thursday of November, as the city began preparing for the holidays, Ethan came home earlier than usual. He had spent the afternoon in a boardroom with his legal team, reviewing the files Marcus had sent. Each page was a reminder of what he owed to luck and ruthlessness, and what it had cost others. He couldn't stop thinking about Naomi's brother, a man whose name he'd never learned until it was too late. When he entered the penthouse, he was startled to find Naomi sitting on the floor of the library. She was surrounded by stacks of books she'd taken down to dust, her legs folded neatly beneath her. For a moment, she looked so young and vulnerable that it made his throat tighten. She didn't notice him at first. Her head was bent over a slim paperback with a faded cover. He saw her lips move as she read, as if she were silently tasting the words. He cleared his throat, and she looked up. In that instant, the mask slipped, just for a heartbeat, and he glimpsed something raw and unguarded in her face. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual composed neutrality. "I'm sorry," she said, rising quickly. "I didn't hear you come in." "What were you reading?" he asked before he could stop himself. Naomi hesitated. "Nothing important." He stepped closer, ignoring the way she stiffened. "May I see?" She hesitated again, then handed him the book. He turned it over in his hands. The title was printed in small, earnest letters: Grassroots Justice, Community Organizing and Change. He looked up to find her watching him warily, as if waiting for him to mock her. "It's about the work you do?" he said softly. "Yes. You care about it." "I do." He nodded, fighting the urge to say more, to tell her that he envied her certainty, her purpose, that all his millions couldn't buy that kind of clarity. But he knew anything he said would sound like manipulation, like another attempt to inch closer to a place he no longer deserved. She took the book back and placed it carefully in the stack. Then she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I don't expect you to understand. I think I do," he whispered. "No," she said gently. "You don't." For the first time since he'd known her, he saw pity in her eyes. It cut deeper than contempt. He watched her gather the rest of the books and slide them back onto the shelves. When she was done, she wiped her hands on a cloth and turned to leave. But before she reached the door, she paused. "You said you were concerned about me," she said without looking back. "If that's true, you should know I'm fine. I don't need saving." Her voice was soft, but the finality in it was unmistakable. After she left, Ethan stood in the library, the hush pressing in on him. The bookshelves gleamed under the recessed lights, each volume neatly aligned. For a moment, he wanted to tear them all down, to smash the illusion of order he had spent his life curating. But instead, he sank into the armchair by the window and rested his head in his hands. He thought of Naomi walking home through the cold. He thought of her brother's file in his briefcase. He thought of the truth, how it waited for him, patient and implacable. And he knew, with a clarity that made him nauseous, that he could not go on like this, that sooner or later he would have to tell her everything. But not tonight. Tonight, he would sit in the dark and try to remember the man he had been before ambition had devoured whatever softer parts of him once existed. He sat there until the city began to glow with the first lights of dawn, feeling as though he were waiting for a verdict that had already been written. Ethan didn't intend to make an offer that night. In fact, he had told himself firmly that he would keep the conversation strictly professional, as neutral as the contract that bound Naomi to his household. But when she arrived early the following evening, carrying a fresh bundle of cleaning cloths and that same canvas tote, he felt a surge of desperation that made his throat ache. It was as if every quiet moment between them had accumulated into a single truth he could no longer pretend he didn't feel. He watched her methodically unpack her supplies, laying each item on the counter as if arranging tools for an operation. She moved with her usual quiet precision, but there was a certain tightness around her mouth that told him she hadn't forgiven or forgotten. He stood by the kitchen island, hands braced on the polished marble, and listened to the faint sound of her breathing over the hush of the apartment. For a moment, he almost turned away, almost retreated behind the familiar armor of disinterest. But the hollow space in his chest had grown too wide to ignore. "Naomi," he began, and when she looked up, he felt the impact of her gaze like a physical weight. "I've been thinking." She didn't speak, but she lifted her chin in that composed way she had, the way that reminded him she was not intimidated by any man, least of all him. "I want to help you," he said, "with the community center." Her expression didn't change. If anything, it grew more unreadable. "Why?" "Because it matters to you," he said quietly. Because I know they're struggling to stay open. I have the resources. I can make it easier. Naomi set the cloth she was holding back into her tote. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to decipher the real cost of such an offer. "Are you offering this because you think it will absolve you?" she asked softly. The question stung more than he expected. He swallowed. "No, I'm offering because I admire what you do, and because I can help. People like you always think money is the answer." He almost flinched at the quiet accusation. "Sometimes it is," he said. "Sometimes money can keep the lights on and pay the rent and buy textbooks." "And what will you want in return?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, though even to his own ears it sounded too easy, too practiced. Her gaze didn't waver. "If you want to make a donation, you can do it anonymously. Otherwise, it will feel like you're buying a piece of me." "I don't want that," he said hoarsely. "Then why can't you just leave it alone?" He didn't have an answer, not one that wouldn't sound selfish or pathetic, because he couldn't stand knowing she looked at him with that mixture of disappointment and pity. Because he wanted, more than anything, to be the sort of man she might respect, even if he never deserved her forgiveness. Naomi took a slow breath. "If you really want to help, fine, but it must be on my terms." He nodded, relief and dread tangled in his chest. "All right. You will not attach your name to it. No press releases, no plaques, no photo opportunities. Agreed. And you will not interfere with how the funds are used." "I won't." She studied him a moment longer, as if trying to gauge whether he was lying. Then she nodded once. "I'll have the director contact your office. After that, I don't want to discuss it again." "Understood." They fell silent. Naomi returned to her cleaning, moving through the rooms with that quiet grace he had once mistaken for detachment. Now he understood it was something closer to survival, a way of claiming space without inviting intrusion. He watched her disappear into the study, the faint smell of lemon polish lingering in her wake. He wished he could feel proud of himself, but all he felt was a strange emptiness. As if he had simply bought a reprieve from his own conscience. When she finished her tasks, she slipped past him without a word. He almost called out to her, almost asked her to stay for a moment longer. But he didn't. Because he knew she had already given him more of her attention than he deserved. After she left, he sat alone at the kitchen island, replaying every word of their conversation. He told himself he'd done the right thing, that this was the first step towards something better. But the truth was, he had no idea how to make amends for a debt he couldn't quantify. The next week passed in a blur of legal consultations and contract revisions. Ethan instructed his legal team to arrange the donation through an anonymous trust. He gave strict orders that there be no press release, no public acknowledgement. When his CFO questioned the decision, Ethan simply said, "Consider it an investment in the city." And if the man suspected there was more to it, he wisely kept his opinions to himself. At night, Ethan lay awake and imagined Naomi at the community center, unaware that the funding was already secured. He tried to picture her relief when she learned the center would stay open another year, the children's programs intact. He wanted to believe that would be enough. That she might, if not forgive him, at least feel something softer in the hollow between them. But when she returned to work the following Monday, she greeted him with the same polite neutrality she had always shown. She moved through the rooms without comment, her focus entirely on her tasks. It should have reassured him, her professionalism, her refusal to let sentiment interfere. Instead, it made him feel as if he'd vanished entirely from her notice. That evening, he lingered in the study long after she'd gone. He stood by the windows, watching the last streaks of winter light fade into darkness. He thought about the man he had been 10 years earlier, hungry, ruthless, determined to carve his place in the world no matter the cost. He wondered if that man would recognize the stranger he'd become. A man who had everything but the one thing he couldn't buy. Respect, redemption, a way back to something like innocence. He was still standing there when his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Marcus. "Donation processed, no link to you. Recipient notified." Ethan typed a curt thank you and slid the phone back into his jacket. For a long time, he didn't move. He tried to convince himself that this was closure, that he'd done what he could. But the quiet of the apartment felt less like peace and more like an indictment. The next day, Naomi arrived at her usual time. She was wearing a charcoal gray coat he'd never seen before, and for one selfish instant, he wondered if she'd bought it with some of the money he'd donated. The thought made his stomach knot with shame. She moved past him with a nod, then stopped just inside the kitchen. When she turned to face him, he felt his heart stutter. "The director told me," she said quietly, "about the donation." He swallowed. "I asked them not to." "I know. They were grateful. They thought I should know." She paused, her gaze steady. "Thank you." He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, she lifted a hand to stop him. "That doesn't change anything," she said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was resolute. "You can't buy your way out of this." "I know," he said. And he did. Naomi nodded once, as if that settled the matter. Then she turned away and began unpacking her tote. Ethan watched her, feeling the hollow place inside him expand. He had thought, naively, that this gesture might soften something between them, that she might look at him differently. But she hadn't asked for his help. She hadn't needed it. And while she was willing to accept the benefit, she would not offer him absolution. He realized then that he didn't deserve it. That night, after she'd left, he wandered the rooms she had cleaned, searching for something he couldn't name. He paused in the kitchen, his gaze falling on the neat arrangement of flowers she'd refreshed earlier. White tulips again. Simple. Unpretentious. He reached out and brushed his fingers across one silken petal, wondering if she chose them because they were her favorite or because they were the cheapest option at the market. He thought of the life she had built, the quiet dignity she maintained in the face of every indignity he had inflicted. And he knew, without any self-delusion, that no donation could erase what he'd done. When he finally went to bed, he lay awake until dawn, the hush of the penthouse pressing against his ears like a rebuke. He told himself he would leave her alone now, that he would keep the distance she had asked for. But even as he made that promise, he knew he was lying, because every time she walked through his door, something in him stirred awake, something restless and hungry and desperate to believe that redemption was still possible. And he suspected that longing would haunt him long after she was gone. In the weeks that followed the donation, Ethan tried to immerse himself in work. He took meetings in Brussels and Dubai, reviewed acquisition proposals, and signed off on new technology partnerships. Every hour was accounted for, every minute filled with purpose, but none of it touched the gnawing unease that had rooted itself in his chest. He told himself that staying busy was a kind of penance, that if he could just accomplish enough, the past might lose its hold on him. But the truth was simpler and more pitiful. He was hiding from the one conversation he knew he could not avoid. Each time he returned home, he half expected to find Naomi gone. It was a thought that left him cold and weightless, as though some essential tether had been severed. But every evening, at precisely 6 o'clock, she walked through the door as if nothing had changed. She never mentioned the donation again. She never mentioned the night he had followed her. She moved through his penthouse with that same precise grace, neither inviting nor rebuffing his presence. He was grateful for her composure, even as it made him feel like a ghost haunting his own life. One evening, after a conference call that stretched past midnight, Ethan found himself standing in the kitchen, unable to remember why he'd come in. The refrigerator door stood ajar, the cool air spilling onto his bare feet. He closed it slowly, pressing his palm to the stainless steel as if the cold might shock him back to himself. He thought of Naomi's brother, David Hart, and the file he still kept locked in his desk. He hadn't opened it again since the day Marcus had sent it, but he carried the weight of its contents everywhere he went. In the quiet, he could almost hear Naomi's voice the first time she'd confronted him. "You watched me. Do you have any idea how that feels?" He wondered if David had felt the same way in those final days, trapped under the gaze of people who saw him only as an obstacle or a liability. Ethan's own signature had never appeared on any of the internal memos, but that didn't absolve him. He had built his fortune on the carcasses of smaller companies, and David Hart had been collateral damage in a war Ethan had never bothered to see up close. He closed his eyes and drew a slow breath. It would be so easy to lock the memory away again, to pretend it wasn't his responsibility. But every time he looked at Naomi, he felt the lie coiling tighter around his throat, and he knew, without any comforting illusions, that he was running out of time to tell her the truth. 3 days later, the decision was made for him. It was a Saturday morning, pale light flooding the penthouse windows. Ethan was reviewing quarterly projections in the study when the building's concierge called to announce a visitor. He almost told them to send the person away, but something in the clerk's voice, a strained politeness, made him pause. "It's a woman, sir," the concierge said. "She says she's from the community center." For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He closed the file on his desk with a trembling hand. "Send her up." He waited by the elevator, his heart pounding in a way he hadn't felt since he was a young man, pitching investors who didn't believe in him. When the doors finally slid open, Naomi stepped out, wearing a navy wool coat and no makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a low knot, and her face was pale with resolve. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed a glimmer of something fragile. "You're always welcome," he said automatically. The words sounded absurd as soon as they left his mouth. She didn't acknowledge them. Instead, she reached into her coat and withdrew a slim file folder. She held it out to him like an offering she wished she could take back. "I need to know something," she said quietly, "and I want you to look me in the eye when you answer." He took the folder, but he didn't open it. "What is this?" "Records," she said, "from Stratus Ventures. One of the volunteers at the center used to work in compliance. He recognized your name. He did some digging." Her gaze didn't waver. "Did you know my brother?" He felt the blood drain from his face. "Naomi? Did you know him?" she repeated, her voice rising just enough to crack. "I knew of him," he admitted. "He was part of the accounting team during the acquisition. I never met him personally." "But you knew what happened to him." He looked down at the folder, unable to meet her gaze. "I knew there was an investigation. I didn't know all the details." "Did you know he died because he tried to expose the fraud?" He swallowed, his throat so tight it hurt. "I didn't." "You didn't what?" she demanded. "You didn't care? You didn't look?" He opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were photocopies of emails and internal memos, some bearing the company letterhead he had once been so proud to display. He recognized the names of men he'd trusted to handle the acquisition, men who had assured him that the transition was clean. Buried in the stack was a single photograph of David Hart, a young man with Naomi's eyes and an expression of exhausted determination. Ethan stared at it until the edges blurred. "I didn't know he was the whistleblower," he whispered. "I swear to you, Naomi, I didn't." "But you knew something happened," she said, "and you never wondered who paid the price." He looked up, and for the first time he saw not just sorrow in her gaze, but contempt. She closed her coat with hands that trembled. "I came here today because I needed to hear it from you," she said. "I needed to know whether you were a man who made a mistake or a man who destroyed people and didn't care." He stepped forward, desperate to close the distance between them. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." She backed away, her expression shattering into something he couldn't bear to see. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say that." "Please," he said, "let me." "There is nothing you can say," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "You think your money can fix everything. You think if you say the right words, you can make this go away. But my brother is dead, and you can't bring him back." He reached for her, but she turned and walked to the elevator without another word. The doors closed on the sight of her profile, pale and resolute, and he felt something inside him splinter. He sank to the floor, the folder still clutched in his hand. He didn't know how long he sat there, the light shifting across the room as the day wore on. Eventually, he rose and carried the file to his desk. He laid it on top of his own copy of the report Marcus had compiled. 2 versions of the same story, one he had paid to discover and one she had carried alone all these years. That evening, he didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the dark, replaying every choice that had led him to this moment. He thought of the boy in the photograph, the determined set of his jaw. He thought of Naomi, her eyes shining with the last pieces of hope she had left. And he thought of himself, Ethan Blackwood, who had built an empire and in the process become the man she now believed him to be. The truth settled over him like a lead blanket. No amount of charity or contrition could erase the fact that he had profited from her brother's ruin, that he had let ambition blind him to the lives he was willing to discard. He pressed his palms to his eyes, wishing he could be the man she had hoped he was. But wishes were for people who hadn't already made their choices. When the first gray light of dawn crept across the windows, he knew what he had to do. He had spent his life believing he could outrun consequences, that if he moved fast enough, nothing could ever catch him. But Naomi Hart had found him anyway, and the only thing left now was to face her, not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as a man prepared to admit he didn't deserve it. He rose from his chair, feeling every one of his 42 years. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel powerful. He felt human, and though he didn't know what came next, he understood that the reckoning had already begun. And this time, there would be no easy absolution. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dim hush of his study, the city's skyline smudged behind the windows, and tried to imagine a version of himself that Naomi could one day look at without flinching. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her expression when she had stepped into the elevator. Something that wasn't only grief or anger, but the final, devastating collapse of trust. He had thought he understood the cost of what he'd done, but watching her walk away had taught him that there were losses no ledger could record. As dawn spread across the penthouse, he rose and moved through the rooms in silence. Everything Naomi had touched seemed charged with her absence, the clean lines of the countertops, the faint scent of lavender on the air, the white tulips she'd left in a vase by the kitchen window. For the first time, he realized he had no idea if she would come back. And worse, he couldn't decide if he had the right to hope she would. By the time his assistant called to confirm his morning meetings, Ethan's voice was steady again. He gave instructions for the rest of the week, rescheduled 2 conference calls, and asked to be left undisturbed for the next several hours. But once he hung up, he didn't return to the contracts waiting on his desk. Instead, he retrieved the 2 folders, Naomi's copy and his own, and sat down to read every page. He forced himself not to look away from any line, not to pretend the signatures and emails were anything but a record of his complicity. Each memorandum felt like a confession he hadn't known he was writing. He stayed there until the afternoon light had shifted across the floor, and when he finally closed the files, his hands were trembling. He thought about all the years he'd told himself he was simply efficient, decisive, willing to do what others could not. How easy it had been to mistake that for virtue. He was still at his desk when a call came through from the community center. For a moment, he couldn't imagine why they would contact him directly. He answered with a hesitant, "This is Ethan Blackwood." A woman's voice, warm but taut, replied, "Mr. Blackwood, this is Joy Sims, the director at the center. I'm sorry to call you personally, but I thought you should know there's been an incident." He felt his chest constrict. "Is Naomi all right?" "She's physically fine," Joy said, though there was an undercurrent in her voice that made him uneasy. "But a city official showed up this morning to inform us that the building lease is under review. They're claiming code violations, but it doesn't feel coincidental." Ethan felt a sick twist in his gut. He knew exactly which official she meant. Councilman Devers had been grumbling for months about that block of property, eager to clear it for redevelopment. Ethan had refused to sell him a parcel adjacent to the center, and Devers had never forgotten a slight. He wondered now if this was retaliation, another invisible war waged over the heads of people who couldn't afford to fight back. "Have you spoken to legal counsel?" he asked. "We have," Joy said carefully, "but I'm calling because Naomi insisted I tell you. She said she thought you might be able to help." The breath he'd been holding left him in a rush. The fact that Naomi had invoked his name at all felt momentous. He closed his eyes and pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I'll handle it." "Mr. Blackwood." "I'll handle it," he repeated more firmly this time. When he hung up, he felt the familiar surge of purpose, the old instinct to outmaneuver and outspend whatever stood in his way. But as he reached for his phone to begin making calls, he forced himself to pause. Naomi had only just confronted him about her brother. She had made it clear that she didn't trust him, that she didn't want anything more from him. And yet, when threatened, she'd still thought to call him. He didn't know if that was desperation or a glimmer of faith, but he understood this was not the time to disappear behind lawyers and proxies. He dialed a direct number he hadn't used in years. Councilman Devers answered on the second ring, his voice thick with the satisfaction of someone convinced he held all the leverage. "Ethan, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I hear you're making trouble for the community center," Ethan said. His tone was low, controlled. "You're going to stop." Devers laughed. "It's nothing personal. We have codes for a reason. That building is old. It's a hazard. You don't care about building codes, and you don't care about nonprofits." "You're right," Ethan said. "I care about leverage, and you know I have more than you." Devers was silent. "You're going to call off your inspectors," Ethan continued. "You're going to forget the lease review ever happened, because if you don't, I will bury your redevelopment proposals under so many injunctions, you'll be out of office before the first brick is laid." "You're bluffing." "Try me," Ethan said. Another long pause. Then Devers sighed. "Fine, I'll back off, but don't expect me to forget this." "I wouldn't dream of it," Ethan said coldly. He ended the call and sat back, the adrenaline draining from his limbs. He knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Men like Devers didn't let go of grudges easily. But at least for tonight, Naomi's work was safe. For a moment, he imagined how she would react when she found out. She would be furious, he thought. She would see it as proof he was still trying to control her life from a distance. And perhaps she'd be right. But he didn't care. Some debts had to be paid, even if they only made the ledger heavier. He spent the next hour making arrangements to have a private building inspector quietly correct any genuine code issues, anonymously, so Naomi wouldn't have to defend his involvement. When everything was in motion, he finally allowed himself to sit in the dark with a tumbler of scotch. He didn't drink it. He only held it, as if the burn of the glass might tether him to something real. Later that night, he heard the soft chime of the elevator. His heart stuttered in his chest. He knew it was her even before she stepped into view. Naomi stood in the doorway, framed by the dim glow of the hall. She was still in the navy coat she'd worn that morning, her eyes dark and guarded. "I'm sorry to come without calling," she said quietly. "You don't have to apologize." She looked around the room as if she were seeing it for the first time. "Joy called me. She said you intervened." "I did," he admitted. Her gaze flicked to his, searching for something he wasn't sure he could give. "Why?" "Because I could," he said. "Because it was the right thing to do." She stepped farther inside, her hands tucked in her coat pockets. "And you think that makes up for everything else?" "No," he said. "I don't." For a moment, the silence felt absolute. Then she exhaled and closed her eyes. "I don't know what to do with you," she whispered. "I don't know how to hate you, and I don't know how to forgive you." He swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "I don't expect forgiveness." "Then what do you expect?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I only know that when something threatened what you care about, I couldn't stand by and watch." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "I keep thinking about my brother," she said, "how he tried to fight for something, and it killed him, and how you walked away untouched." "I didn't walk away," Ethan said softly. "I just didn't look back." She shook her head as if she couldn't decide whether to despise him or pity him. "You could have destroyed Devers with a phone call. You did, just like that." "I've always been good at winning," he said bitterly. "It's the only thing I ever learned how to do." Naomi studied him for a long, searching moment. Then she looked away, her jaw trembling. "I can't be grateful for this," she said. "I don't want your gratitude." "Then why does this feel like another transaction?" He couldn't answer, and in the end, she didn't wait for him to try. She turned and walked back to the elevator, each step measured and deliberate. He watched her disappear into the hush of the hallway, knowing that whatever lay between them now had become something that could never be named, let alone repaired. As the doors closed, he felt the weight of every choice he'd ever made settling over him like a final judgment. And for the first time, he wondered if this was what redemption really looked like. Not absolution or reconciliation, but the stark, unadorned truth that some damages could never be undone. The following morning unfolded with a brittle, fragile quiet that felt more ominous than any argument. Ethan went through the motions of his day, reading reports, responding to emails, fielding questions from investors, but none of it registered. Every time he tried to concentrate, his mind returned to Naomi's face as she had stood in the doorway the night before, her eyes full of a hurt that neither of them knew how to name. He had thought there might be some grim satisfaction in finally telling her the truth about his role in her brother's death, but the reality was emptier than he could have imagined. Confession didn't absolve. It only laid the ruin bare for both of them to see. By noon, he abandoned any pretense of productivity and closed his laptop. The silence of the penthouse was suffocating, pressing against his chest like a physical weight. He wandered the rooms aimlessly, stopping at the bookshelf Naomi had organized. He trailed his fingers over the spines, as if the neat order she'd imposed might anchor him to something solid. But all he felt was a dull ache, a reminder of how little he deserved the small graces she had offered. He was still standing there when his phone rang. The display showed a number he didn't recognize. For one irrational moment, he hoped it might be Naomi, even though he knew she would never call him again. He pressed the green icon, his voice hoarse. "This is Ethan Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, this is Joyce Sims." Her tone was taut with urgency. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but Naomi hasn't shown up for her classes this morning. She didn't call, and she's not answering her phone." The bottom dropped out of his stomach. "When did you last speak to her?" "Last night. She was upset, but she said she'd be here today." He pinched the bridge of his nose, fighting the surge of panic. "Do you have her address?" "I do, but—" "Text it to me," he interrupted. "Please." He ended the call before she could argue. His hands were shaking as he pulled on his coat. In the back of his mind, he knew he had no right to go to her. He had forfeited that claim long ago, but some primal instinct refused to let him stay away. If something had happened, if she was hurt, he couldn't stand the thought. The drive across the city passed in a blur of red lights and half-registered street signs. He parked in front of a squat brick building that looked even more tired in daylight. For a moment, he sat in the car, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Then he climbed out and climbed the steps to the narrow door. He raised his hand to knock, but the door swung open before he touched it. Naomi stood there, barefoot and pale, her hair unpinned and falling around her face. For a second, she looked as startled as he felt. Then her expression shuddered into something flat and unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I was worried," he said, breathing hard. "You shouldn't be. You didn't show up," he said. "You didn't answer your phone. That doesn't mean you have the right to come here." He swallowed. "I know, but I had to be sure you were safe." She stepped back, her arms folding over her chest. "I'm fine." He hesitated in the doorway, torn between retreat and the need to say what he'd rehearsed 100 times. Finally, he drew a slow breath. "Naomi, please," he said. "I know you don't owe me anything, but I need you to understand that I never meant for any of this to happen." Her mouth tightened. "Do you think that matters?" "No," he admitted, "but it's the truth." "People always say that," she said quietly. "They say they didn't mean it, that it wasn't personal. But it was personal to my brother. It was his life." "I know." She looked down at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was low. "He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. But he believed in something. He thought if he just told the truth, someone would listen." "I should have," Ethan said. "I should have listened." Her gaze lifted, and for the first time he saw her eyes shimmer with unshed tears. "I used to wonder," she whispered, "what would have happened if someone in your position had just cared enough to look." He felt his own throat close. "I'm sorry." She didn't reply. She just stood there, her shoulders trembling. He wanted to cross the space between them, to hold her, to promise something, anything that might soften the grief between them. But he knew that would be a lie. There was nothing he could promise that wouldn't feel like another theft. A soft chime sounded behind her, a timer going off in the kitchen. She turned without a word and disappeared down the hall. He stayed frozen in the doorway, his heart thudding in the hush she left behind. He should have left. He knew that. But instead, he stepped inside and closed the door. The apartment was small and spare, furnished with second-hand pieces that were immaculately kept. A stack of lesson plans rested on the coffee table beside a battered mug. The air smelled faintly of chamomile tea and something sweet baking in the oven. It struck him as so achingly ordinary, so full of the quiet life she'd built from the wreckage he'd helped cause, that he had to close his eyes. When he opened them again, Naomi was standing in the kitchen doorway. She held a folded dish towel in her hands, her expression unreadable. "You can't keep doing this," she said. "You can't keep showing up and expecting me to help you feel better." "I know," he said, "but I can't pretend I don't care what happens to you. Caring doesn't change what you did." "No," he said softly, "but it's the only thing I have left." They stared at each other across the narrow room. For a moment, he thought she might ask him to leave, but instead, she turned back to the counter and began to plate the small loaf she'd pulled from the oven. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. "My brother used to make this when we were kids," she said. "He said it tasted like hope." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "May I sit?" She didn't look up. "If you want." He sank into the nearest chair, unsure what to do with his hands. He watched her slice the loaf into even pieces, her movements precise and almost ritualistic. When she finished, she set one plate in front of him. She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. They ate in silence. The bread was warm and faintly sweet, the kind of simple comfort he hadn't tasted in decades. He thought of all the meals he'd eaten alone in his penthouse, every bite seasoned with an emptiness he'd never been able to name. When he finished, he set the plate aside. His voice felt raw when he finally spoke. "Thank you." Naomi studied him, her gaze steady. "This doesn't change anything," she said. "I know. But maybe it's a start," she added, so quietly he almost wondered if he'd imagined it. Hope flared in his chest, fragile as a match struck in the dark. He didn't dare breathe too hard, in case it went out. Naomi stood and carried their plates to the sink. She didn't ask him to leave, but she didn't invite him to stay either. He took the hint and rose slowly. When he reached the door, he paused and looked back at her. She was standing at the window, her hands braced on the sill, her face turned toward the pale winter light. "Naomi," he said, his voice rough, "if you ever need anything, I'll be here." She didn't turn, but after a moment, she nodded. He let himself out and walked into the brittle cold of the afternoon. For the first time in months, he felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't peace, but it was enough to let him draw a full breath. As he reached his car, he looked up at the window where she stood. She was still there, framed by the light, her silhouette as steady as ever. He knew this wasn't the end of anything, that there were still truths between them, heavy as unspent grief. But for the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, some debts could be repaid not with money or power, but with the simple, stubborn act of showing up. He drove away slowly, carrying the memory of her face with him, like a fragile promise he didn't yet know how to keep. Ethan didn't go back to the penthouse right away. He drove without a destination, the city's winter dusk, softening the hard lines of buildings he'd known all his life. At every intersection, he thought of turning around, going back to Naomi's small apartment, just to look at her face one more time. But he didn't. He knew that what lay between them was too fragile to bear the weight of another intrusion. So he kept driving until the streets blurred into a wash of headlights and shadow. When he finally returned home, the penthouse was so still it felt like a mausoleum. He didn't bother turning on the lights. He left his coat draped over a chair and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sky deepen from gray to ink. Somewhere below, life was happening. Children being called in for dinner, laughter spilling from open doorways, lights flickering on one by one. But up here, there was only the hush he'd made for himself. A hush he'd mistaken for peace. He knew as he stood there that something had shifted between him and Naomi. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even understanding. But it was a door cracked open, just wide enough for something like truth to slip through. And for the first time in years, he felt no urge to slam it shut. The following morning, he called Joy Sims to confirm that the community center had received the building inspector's report. Everything was in order. No further threats of eviction. Joy thanked him in a cautious, polite tone that made it clear she knew the cost of accepting help from men like him. He didn't blame her. He didn't expect gratitude anymore. He spent the day closing out minor projects, delegating decisions that once would have required his signature. He returned calls from board members who were politely curious about his absence, and when they asked if he was ill, he said only that he was attending to personal matters. No one pressed. In his world, personal mattered less than profit. That evening, he walked through the penthouse one last time. He didn't know why it felt like a farewell. Maybe because he finally understood that no amount of square footage or glass walls could make a place feel like home. Naomi had never belonged here. He wasn't sure he had either. A little after 7, he left a single envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside was a letter he'd rewritten a dozen times, each draft stripped of the excuses that had once come so easily. This version was simple, almost stark, a confession, an apology without expectation, a promise to step back. He didn't know if she would read it. He only knew he couldn't look her in the eye again without offering it. As he was about to leave, he paused by the vase of white tulips she'd arranged weeks earlier. Most of the petals had browned at the edges, but a few still held their shape. He thought of Naomi's hands smoothing the stems into place, the quiet care she brought to every task. He left them where they were. The next morning, he drove to the community center. He arrived early, before the children poured in with their backpacks and noise. He sat in his car, watching the doorway. Naomi appeared just before 8, her dark hair pinned neatly back, her expression composed. She didn't see him. She unlocked the front door and disappeared inside. He waited another hour before he finally gathered the courage to follow. Inside, the main hall smelled of coffee and construction paper. He found Joy in her office, sorting boxes of donated supplies. "She's here," Joy said before he could speak. "But I'm not sure she wants to see you." He nodded. "I understand." Joy hesitated, studying him with guarded compassion. "You know," she said slowly, "Naomi isn't someone who forgives easily, but she doesn't hold on to bitterness the way you think she does." He swallowed. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness." "Then why are you here?" He thought of Naomi's face in the kitchen, her voice when she'd said she didn't know how to hate him. He thought of all the years he'd believed remorse was weakness. Finally, he drew a breath. "Because I need her to know that even if she never speaks to me again, I'm not walking away this time." Joy nodded once. She didn't smile, but something in her expression softened. She gestured toward the hallway. "You can try." He walked slowly, feeling each step like a question he wasn't sure how to answer. He found Naomi in one of the smaller classrooms, kneeling to help a little girl tape a torn construction paper star back together. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The child glanced between them, then scampered away. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," he began, his voice rough. "You said you wouldn't," she said quietly. "I know, and I meant it. But this is the last time." She stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. "Why are you here, Ethan?" He hesitated. "Because I needed to see you," he said. "Because I needed you to have this." He held out the envelope. She didn't take it right away. Instead, she looked at it as if it might burn her fingers. "What is it?" she asked. "The truth," he said simply. "Nothing more." After a long pause, she took it from him. She didn't open it. She only held it, her gaze never leaving his face. "I know I've said this before," he said, his voice unsteady, "but I need you to hear me. I'm sorry for what happened to your brother. I'm sorry I didn't look closer. I'm sorry that all I knew how to do was win." Naomi looked down at the envelope in her hands. When she spoke, her voice was so low he had to lean in to hear it. "And what are you now?" she asked. "If you're not that man anymore." "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm trying to find out." Her throat worked, as if she were swallowing words she didn't trust herself to say. Finally, she nodded. "You should go," she whispered. He didn't argue. He turned to leave, but as he reached the doorway, her voice stopped him. "Ethan." He turned back. She was standing in the pale morning light, the envelope pressed against her chest. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He nodded once, unable to speak, and then he left her there, in the room she'd claimed as her own, the place she had built into something good. Outside, the winter air smelled clean. For the first time in years, he felt as if he were breathing without effort. He climbed into his car and sat with his hands on the wheel, letting the moment settle over him. He knew this wasn't redemption. It wasn't absolution. It was simply the first honest thing he'd done in a long time. Days passed, then a week. He didn't hear from Naomi. He didn't expect to. He went back to his work, but he moved differently through his days, as if some hidden weight had shifted. He told the truth more often, even when it cost him. He called his mother for the first time in months. He walked through the city without hiding behind tinted windows. And when he passed the community center, he sometimes saw Naomi through the glass, her head bent as she read to a child. She never looked up. He never went inside. One evening, as he was leaving the office, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He opened it, his heart stumbling in his chest. "I read your letter." That was all it said. No accusation, no forgiveness, just a statement of fact. He read it again, then set the phone down. In that moment, he realized that some endings weren't clean. That sometimes the best you could hope for was to stand in the ruins of what you'd broken and tell the truth about how it happened. And maybe if you were very lucky, someone would hear you. He didn't know what came next. He only knew he was ready to find out. Sometimes the greatest lesson in life is that remorse alone isn't enough to heal the damage we've caused. Ethan's story reminds us that no matter how powerful we become or how many resources we control, our past choices have consequences that can't be erased with a check or a well-crafted apology. True accountability isn't about seeking forgiveness to soothe our guilt. It's about having the courage to stand in front of the person we've wronged and acknowledge the harm without excuses, knowing they have every right to walk away. Naomi's quiet strength shows us that healing doesn't always mean reconciliation. She chose her dignity over bitterness, her purpose over revenge. She never let her pain become her entire identity, and she refused to let Ethan's regret define her future. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic gesture or an expensive gift that mattered. It was the simple, honest act of showing up, telling the truth, and accepting that redemption doesn't come with guarantees. This story challenges us to ask ourselves who we've failed to see clearly, who we've hurt by neglect or ambition, and what it would take to face them without expecting anything in return. It asks us to consider whether we're willing to change, not for applause, but because it's the only way to honor the humanity in others and in ourselves. If you found this story meaningful, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What did this story make you feel or reflect on? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our future stories about redemption, courage, and the quiet power of telling the truth.